Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in Tel Aviv's Kings of Israel Square on the night of November 4, 1995, was electric, thick with a hope so palpable you could almost taste it. 100,000 people were packed into the plaza, a sea of faces illuminated by the warm glow of stage lights. They were singing. It was a peace rally, a massive demonstration of support for a process that felt, to many, like a national miracle. For decades, the story of Israel had been one of war, of survival, of clenched fists and vigilance. But now, something was changing. The architect of that change, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, stood on the stage, a man visibly uncomfortable with public displays of emotion, yet he was singing along, a sheepish smile on his face. The song was Shir L'Shalom, the song for peace. Its lyrics spoke of a new day, of not whispering prayers for peace but shouting them. Rabin was a man forged in conflict, a commander in the elite Palmach unit before Israel was even a state, a general who led his country to a stunning victory in the Six-Day War, a defense minister, a lifelong soldier. He was nicknamed Mr. Security, the embodiment of Israeli strength. For a man like him to stand on a stage and sing for peace alongside his political rival, Shimon Peres, felt like history turning a page. He had shaken the hand of his old enemy, Yasser Arafat, on the White House lawn. He was steering his nation toward the Oslo Accords, a risky, controversial, but hopeful path toward a two-state solution with the Palestinians. The crowd felt it. This was the culmination, a powerful statement that the people were with him. After the song, Rabin, his voice raspy but firm, delivered his final words to the nation he had served his entire life. He said, "I have always believed that the majority of the people want peace and are ready to take risks for peace." As the rally concluded, he walked off stage, surrounded by a cordon of Shin Bet security agents. He moved toward his armored Cadillac, a man of 73, buoyed by the energy of the crowd. He was just feet from the car door when a figure stepped out of the shadows. A young man wearing a yarmulke reached out with a 9mm Beretta pistol. Thrun shots cracked through the night air, silencing the lingering cheers. The first shot missed. The second slammed into Rabin's back, piercing his spleen and lung. The third hit a security guard. The Prime Minister of Israel slumped into the arms of his agents, mortally wounded. The dream of peace, so vibrant just moments before, was bleeding out on the cold pavement of a Tel Aviv parking lot. The assassination of a head of state is always a seismic event. But this was different. This was not the work of a foreign enemy or a terrorist organization. The assassin was an Israeli, a Jew, a law student from a religious family who believed he was acting on God's orders. The murder of Yitzhak Rabin was a fratricide, a crime that tore open the soul of a nation and exposed a schism so deep it threatened the very foundations of the state. It was the end point of a terrifying journey, the culmination of a process that had turned political disagreement into religious mandate and a young student into a cold-blooded killer. Today, we dissect the anatomy of that process. We explore the anatomy of political radicalization. We will examine the forces that created the assassin Yigal Amir, the political climate that nurtured his hatred, and how one man's fanatical certainty managed to veto the will of a nation and change the course of history. To understand how Yigal Amir could bring himself to murder Yitzhak Rabin, you must first understand the man Rabin was and the profound transformation he underwent in the eyes of his people, particularly the religious nationalist right. Rabin's life story is, in many ways, the story of Israel itself. Born in Jerusalem in 1922, he was a Sabra, a native-born Israeli, a member of the first generation to come of age in the land. He was not a creature of politics or ideology in the European sense. He was a pragmatist, a military man to his core. He joined the Palmach, the elite fighting force of the pre-state Jewish community, at the age of 19. He fought in the 1948 War of Independence, a brutal conflict that forged the new state in blood and fire. His reputation was built on his quiet competence, his strategic mind, and his unwavering commitment to the security of Israel. He rose through the ranks of the newly formed Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, eventually becoming its chief of staff in 1964. It was in this role that he cemented his legendary status. In June of 1967, Rabin commanded the IDF during the Six-Day War. In a stunning preemptive strike and a lightning-fast campaign, Israeli forces defeated the combined armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, capturing the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and most symbolically, East Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Western Wall. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Judaism's holiest site was under Jewish control. Rabin, the secular soldier, became the liberator of Jerusalem. This victory transformed him into a national hero, the ultimate guarantor of Israeli security. For the religious Zionist movement, this was more than a military victory. It was a messianic event, a divine sign that the redemption of the Jewish people was at hand. The newly captured territories, especially the West Bank, the biblical Judea and Samaria, were seen not as occupied land, but as liberated ancestral homeland. After his military career, Rabin transitioned into diplomacy and politics, serving as Israel's ambassador to the United States and later as prime minister in the mid-1970s. But it was his return to power in 1992 that set the stage for the tragedy to come. The world had changed. The Cold War was over, and a new window for peace in the Middle East had opened. The First Intifada, a Palestinian uprising in the occupied territories, had shown that the status quo was unsustainable. Rabin, the old general, ran on a platform of seeking peace, but a peace born of strength. He famously said, "We will fight terror as if there are no peace negotiations, and we will negotiate for peace as if there is no terror." He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the heavy price of war, and he came to believe that true, long-term security for Israel could not be achieved through military might alone. It required a political solution. This led to the secret back-channel negotiations in Norway, which culminated in the 1993 Oslo Accords. The image of Yitzhak Rabin on the White House lawn, awkwardly but resolutely shaking the hand of PLO chairman Yasser Arafat, a man he had long considered a terrorist, was a political earthquake. For many Israelis, and for the world, it was a moment of breathtaking hope. But for a significant and vocal minority in Israel, it was an act of profound betrayal. The man who had conquered Judea and Samaria was now planning to give it away. The hero of 1967 was negotiating with terrorists and planning to cede holy, divinely promised land to them. This was not just a political disagreement. For the religious right, it was a theological crisis. It was sacrilege. Rabin, Mr. Security, was recast as a traitor, a rotif, a pursuer who was endangering the Jewish people and defying God's will. And it was in this fertile ground of rage, betrayal, and theological certainty that the seeds of Yigal Amir's radicalism took root and grew into a murderous ideology. Yigal Amir was born in 1970 in Herzliya, a suburb of Tel Aviv. He was one of 8 children in a devout Yemenite Orthodox Jewish family. His father was a scribe, meticulously copying Torah scrolls by hand, and his mother ran a nursery school. By all accounts, it was a warm, loving, and deeply religious household. Amir was a bright student, excelling in his studies at a state-run religious school. He was seen as a leader, charismatic and confident, but also possessing a stubborn, argumentative streak. From a young age, his life was structured around the twin pillars of Jewish law and Israeli nationalism. His path was a common one for young men in the religious Zionist community. He enrolled in a Hesder yeshiva. The Hesder program is a unique Israeli institution that combines advanced Talmudic studies with mandatory military service in the IDF. The idea is to create soldiers who are not only skilled fighters, but also deeply grounded in their religious faith. It is designed to produce the ideal religious Zionist citizen. Amir served in the prestigious Golani Brigade, an infantry unit known for its toughness. He was a good soldier, a squad leader, but his service was marked by a growing sense of religious and political extremism. He was deeply affected by the First Intifada, developing a visceral hatred for Arabs. He began to feel that the secular Israeli government was weak, failing to deal decisively with the Palestinian threat. After his military service, Amir enrolled at Bar Ilan University, a religious university near Tel Aviv, to study law and computer science. It was here, in the intellectual and political ferment of the university campus, that his radical ideas began to crystallize into a coherent and dangerous worldview. He became a campus activist, organizing protests against the Oslo Accords. He traveled frequently to the West Bank, forging connections with radical settlers in places like Hebron, the epicenter of Jewish-Arab friction. He became convinced that the Oslo Accords were not just a political mistake, but a violation of Jewish law, the halakha. He believed that giving up any part of the land of Israel, which he saw as a divine inheritance, was a grave sin. Amir began to immerse himself in obscure and extremist interpretations of Jewish texts. He was searching for a religious justification for the violent thoughts that were beginning to consume him. He found it in 2 ancient concepts of Jewish law, din rodif and din moser. A rodif, or pursuer, is someone who is actively trying to kill you. Jewish law permits, and in some cases requires, killing a rodif preemptively to save the life of the potential victim. A moser, or informer, is someone who hands over a fellow Jew or Jewish property to a non-Jewish enemy. This is also considered a capital offense in some traditional interpretations. Amir, along with a small circle of like-minded extremists, came to a terrifying conclusion. By planning to withdraw from the West Bank and give land to the Palestinians, Yitzhak Rabin was endangering Jewish lives. He was, in their twisted logic, a rodif. By ceding parts of the Holy Land to a non-Jewish entity, he was also a moser. Therefore, according to their interpretation of halakha, killing Yitzhak Rabin was not murder. It was a righteous act, a religious obligation to save the Jewish people and the land of Israel. He wasn't alone in this thinking, but he was unique in his determination to act. He sought validation from radical rabbis, some of whom gave ambiguous answers that he interpreted as approval. He tried to organize a militia to attack Palestinians. He and his brother, Haggai, and a friend, Dror Adani, began to stockpile weapons and experiment with explosives, but their plots were amateurish and unfocused. Slowly, Yigal Amir came to believe that the only way to stop the Oslo process was to eliminate its architect. He began to stalk Yitzhak Rabin, studying his security detail, looking for a weakness. He made 3 attempts on Rabin's life prior to November 4th. Each time, he was thwarted by security or a simple lack of opportunity. But his resolve never wavered. He believed he was on a divine mission. His personal certainty had become absolute, eclipsing any sense of morality, law, or humanity. He was no longer just a student or a soldier. He had become an instrument of what he saw as God's will. The radicalization of a single individual, like Yigal Amir, does not happen in a vacuum. It requires an environment, an atmosphere that validates and amplifies extremist beliefs until they seem like mainstream common sense to those who hold them. In Israel, between 1993 and 1995, that atmosphere was toxic. The signing of the Oslo Accords split the country in two, creating a political and cultural chasm deeper than any it had known before. For the supporters of the peace process, it was a historic breakthrough, a chance to end a century of conflict. For the opponents, it was a national catastrophe, a suicidal pact with an unrepentant enemy. The public discourse devolved into a brutal, no-holds-barred war of words, where political opponents were not just wrong, but were enemies of the state, traitors to the Jewish people. The opposition to Rabin was led by the Likud party, headed by a charismatic and aggressive young politician named Benjamin Netanyahu. While Netanyahu and other mainstream politicians never explicitly called for violence, the rhetoric they employed was inflammatory and, many would later argue, reckless. They painted Rabin as a danger to Israel, a naive leader who was being duped by Arafat. They led massive rallies where the anger of the crowd was palpable. At these protests, the imagery and language crossed a dangerous line from political opposition to violent incitement. Posters were brandished showing Rabin dressed in a Nazi SS uniform. Others depicted him wearing an Arab keffiyeh, the symbol of his supposed partner, Yasser Arafat. Chants of Rabin is a traitor and Rabin is a murderer were commonplace. Effigies of the Prime Minister were burned. This political vitriol was amplified by a number of extremist rabbis, particularly from the settler movement. These rabbis issued religious edicts, or pask din, that declared the Oslo Accords to be in violation of Jewish law. They were the ones who resurrected and weaponized the concepts of din rodif and din moser, applying them to the elected leader of a democratic state. They gave a theological framework to the political rage. They provided the divine justification that someone like Yigal Amir was seeking. They created a reality where murdering the prime minister could be seen not as a crime, but as a mitzvah, a holy deed. This created a permission structure for violence. When the leader of the opposition party is marching in a mock funeral procession for Rabin, when posters of the prime minister in an SS uniform are waved at mainstream rallies, and when influential rabbis are declaring his actions to be a capital offense against God, the line between legitimate protest and incitement to murder becomes dangerously blurred. In the months leading up to the assassination, the threats against Rabin and other government officials escalated dramatically. But there was a catastrophic failure to appreciate the danger. The Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, was responsible for the prime minister's safety. It was, and is, one of the most sophisticated and effective security agencies in the world. It was brilliant at thwarting external threats from Palestinian terror groups, but it was culturally and psychologically unprepared for a threat from within, from a nice Jewish boy like Yigal Amir. The agency had informants in the radical right-wing circles. They knew about Amir's friend, Avishai Raviv, who was a Shin Bet informant himself, codenamed Champagne. Raviv knew about Amir's extremist views, but either failed to understand the seriousness of his intent or failed to report it effectively. The official state inquiry after the assassination, the Shamgar Commission, would later issue a scathing report on the Shin Bet's failures. It found a shocking level of incompetence and a complete breakdown of basic security procedures on the night of the murder. The security cordon around Rabin was porous. The area had not been properly sterilized. Intelligence warnings about a heightened threat were not acted upon. There was a collective failure of imagination. The prevailing belief was that a Jew would not kill a Jew over politics. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, a fatal underestimation of the power of religious fanaticism when mixed with political poison. The atmosphere of hate had done its work. It had convinced one man that he had the right and the duty to act, and it had blinded the nation's guardians to the danger that was growing in their midst. The night of November 4, 1995 was the culmination of this 2-hour-long storm. At the peace rally, Yitzhak Rabin seemed to finally understand the depth of the public support for his vision. He was, by nature, a reserved and somewhat gloomy man, burdened by the weight of his decisions. But on that stage, he was relaxed, even joyful. The massive crowd, singing and cheering, was a powerful antidote to the relentless campaign of hatred that had been waged against him. It was a confirmation that he was on the right path. As he prepared to leave, he folded a piece of paper with the lyrics to the Song for Peace and placed it in his jacket pocket. It was a small, personal memento of a triumphant evening. Yigal Amir had been waiting for hours. He had scouted the location meticulously. He knew the Prime Minister would exit from a specific staircase leading down to the VIP parking lot. He had tried to get closer at an earlier event but had been stopped. This time he found a loophole in the security. He simply walked into the supposedly sterile area behind the stage and loitered near Rabin's car, mingling with drivers and low-level staff. He was young, clean-cut, wearing a yarmulke. He didn't look like an assassin. No one challenged him. He waited patiently, his Beretta pistol tucked into the small of his back, his heart filled with a cold, divine certainty. As Rabin and his entourage descended the stairs, Amir saw his moment. He let the Prime Minister walk past him, then stepped forward, extending his arm. He was just a few feet away. The shots were fired in rapid succession. The scene descended into chaos. Security agents, who had failed to see the threat just seconds before, now piled on top of Amir, disarming and subduing him. Others bundled the wounded Prime Minister into his car. In the confusion, no one initially realized the severity of Rabin's injuries. The driver was told he had just been bruised, possibly from the force of being pushed into the vehicle. It was only when Rabin became unresponsive that the driver, realizing something was terribly wrong, diverted from the plan to take him home and sped toward Yitzhak Hospital, just a few minutes away. The bullet that struck Rabin's back had done catastrophic damage. It had entered his torso, shredded his spleen, and torn through a major pulmonary blood vessel. He was bleeding internally, massively. By the time he reached the hospital, he had no blood pressure and no pulse. Doctors worked frantically for over an hour, performing open-heart surgery, transfusing dozens of units of blood, trying to restart his heart. But the damage was too extensive. At 11:15 p.m., Yitzhak Rabin, the 73-year-old soldier, general, and prime minister of Israel, was pronounced dead. Back at the square, Yigal Amir was in custody, a slight, chillingly calm smile on his face. When the police asked him why he did it, he answered without hesitation. "I acted alone on God's orders," he said. "I have no regrets." He explained his actions with the cold logic of a true believer. He had done what he had to do to stop the Oslo Accords, to prevent the surrender of the land of Israel. In his mind, he was not a murderer. He was a savior. As the news of Rabin's death spread, a wave of shock, grief, and disbelief washed over the nation. The people who had been singing for peace just hours before now gathered in the same square to weep, to light memorial candles, and to ask themselves a single agonizing question. How had this happened? How had their society, their democracy, produced this killer? The bullet had not just ended a life, it had shattered a nation's sense of self. The aftermath of the assassination was a period of intense national soul-searching and political turmoil. Israel was a nation in mourning, but it was also a nation deeply, furiously divided. The political left and supporters of the peace process blamed the right-wing opposition and the extremist rabbis for creating the atmosphere of incitement that led directly to the murder. They pointed to the posters of Rabin in an SS uniform, the chants of "traitor," and the religious edicts as the moral ammunition for Amir's gun. The political right, while condemning the murder, pushed back against the accusation of collective guilt. They argued that the act was the work of a lone, deranged extremist, and that to blame all of Rabin's political opponents was a cynical and manipulative attempt to silence legitimate dissent. The wound in the national psyche was deep, and it was salted with accusation and recrimination. Shimon Peres, Rabin's foreign minister and partner in the peace process, automatically became acting prime minister. He pledged to continue Rabin's legacy, to push forward with the Oslo Accords. For a brief period, it seemed as though the national trauma might galvanize support for peace, a kind of Rabin's legacy mandate. But the moment was fleeting. The assassination had empowered the very forces it was meant to stop. The peace process, which had relied so heavily on Rabin's personal credibility as a security figure, began to falter. A wave of devastating suicide bombings by the Palestinian militant group Hamas in early 1996 shattered the Israeli public's sense of security and eroded their faith in the peace process. Peres, seen as less tough on security than Rabin, was unable to stop the attacks. In May 1996, just 6 months after the assassination, Israel held new elections. In a stunning upset, Benjamin Netanyahu, the man who had led the fiery opposition to Rabin, was elected prime minister by the narrowest of margins. His victory was a clear sign that the political pendulum had swung away from the Land for Peace formula of the Oslo Accords and toward a more hardline, security-focused approach. The spirit of Oslo was dead. The assassination had, in effect, achieved its goal. Yigal Amir's veto had been successful. The trial of Yigal Amir began in early 1996. It was a short and straightforward affair. The evidence was overwhelming. He had confessed, and the act was caught on a grainy amateur video. Amir's defense was not to deny the act, but to justify it. He used the courtroom as a platform to expound his extremist ideology, arguing that he was not bound by the laws of a state that he believed was acting against the higher law of the Torah. He showed no remorse, no flicker of doubt. He was calm, articulate, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. In March 1996, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 6 years for injuring the security guard. His brother Haggai and their friend Dror Adani were also convicted for their roles in the conspiracy and received lengthy prison sentences. In the years since, Yigal Amir has remained in solitary confinement, an unrepentant symbol of the religious fanaticism that killed a prime minister. He has married from prison and fathered a son, continuing to be a figure of fascination and revulsion. For the extreme right, he remains a hero in some circles, a political prisoner who acted out of principle. For the vast majority of Israelis, he is the man who murdered not only their leader, but also their best hope for peace. The assassination left a permanent scar on Israeli society. It demonstrated the fragility of its democracy and the deadly potential of internal division. The peace process that Yitzhak Rabin championed never recovered. It slowly unraveled through years of failed negotiations, violence, and the Second Intifada, a far deadlier uprising that began in 2000. The dream of a two-state solution, once so close, receded into the realm of the impossible. The Kings of Israel Square was renamed Rabin Square, a permanent monument to the man and the moment that was lost. In the end, the story of Yitzhak Rabin's assassination is a case study in the anatomy of political radicalization. It reveals that such an act is never the product of a single cause, but the result of a deadly convergence of factors. It begins with an individual, like Yigal Amir, who possesses a rigid, binary worldview, a psychological predisposition to see the world in absolute terms of good and evil, righteous and wicked. This individual is then exposed to an ideology, in this case, a radical interpretation of religious Zionism that provides a framework for their grievances and a justification for extreme action. It gives them a vocabulary, Rodef Moser, that transforms political opponents into mortal theological enemies. This process is then accelerated by a toxic political environment. When mainstream leaders engage in dehumanizing rhetoric, when they tolerate or encourage imagery that equates their rivals with the most evil figures in history, they create a permission structure. They signal to the extremists on the fringes that their rage is legitimate, that their targets are deserving of hatred. Finally, there is the failure of the institutions meant to protect the society. The Shin Bet's inability to recognize the threat from within, its failure of imagination, created the physical opportunity for the ideology to be translated into action. The individual, the ideology, the political climate, and the institutional failure all aligned on the night of November 4, 1995, in a Tel Aviv parking lot. The murder of Yitzhak Rabin serves as a dark and enduring reminder that words have consequences. It shows how political speech, when laced with the poison of incitement and the certainty of religious dogma, can become a weapon as deadly as any bullet. The assassin, Yigal Amir, believed he was acting on the orders of God, but his true mandate came from the culture of hatred that had been allowed to fester and grow in the heart of his own society. He pulled the trigger, but the gun was loaded by the voices that told him his prime minister was a traitor, that compromise was a sin, and that murder could be a holy act. The tragedy is not just that a great leader was lost, but that the assassin's veto was, in the long run, successful, derailing a historic chance for peace. Yitzhak Rabin's last public act was to sing a song for peace, but the final discordant note of that night belonged to the Zealot, a sound that has echoed through the decades, a chilling testament to how easily a dream can be murdered by a single, self-righteous bullet. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.